Hey folks, in the last video we ended our discussion of plant water and sugar transport and talked about transpiration and translocation and have a good handle now on the anatomy and morphology of plants and how plants actually move those fluids around the plant body. What I want to do now is move into plant nutrition and specifically address the question of how plants acquire the mineral nutrients that they need to survive. And so we'll talk about how this is done, where these nutrients come from, how that nutrient uptake occurs, and then we'll talk about some nutritional adaptations that we see in different plant groups. So this is not a new question by any means. Where does a plant get its mass? And this is actually something that this is an experiment that was done in the early 1600s by Jean-Baptiste von Helmont. And he asked the question, and this was, like I said, in the 1600s, he asked the question, where's the mass of a growing plant come from? And he set up a really simple experiment to address this question. In this experiment, the hypothesis is that the mass of that growing plant comes from the soil. And so the experiment that was set up is with a willow tree. And so he took a willow sapling, 2 kilogram willow sapling, added a known amount of soil, 90 kilograms of soil, and put these two together. And so we've got the starting weights of both of these. And then allow this is a long-term experiment, 5 years, allow this plant to grow, and then measure after 5 years what the soil weight, the soil mass, and the plant mass are. And so the prediction here is that after 5 years, the soil mass is going to decrease by the same amount that the plant mass increased. This is under the hypothesis that this mass is coming, the mass of the plant comes from the soil itself. The null hypothesis here is that the mass doesn't come from the soil, and so there's going to be some that soil mass is not going to decrease throughout the course of the experiment. And so what we see here is something that was actually a surprise at that time. That after 5 years, the mass of the soil decreased by 0.066%, and so went down by 0.06 kilograms. This is a very small decrease in the amount of soil, but the weight of the mass of the willow tree increased 3,700%. And so the conclusion from this is that certainly the mass didn't come from the soil. And so where does the mass from the plant come from? And this is, not necessarily an intuitive answer. And so, thinking about it, it's like this made sense to set this up this way and to try and to test whether the mass is coming from the soil. But it turns out, of course, that it doesn't. And where does that mass come from? Well, it comes from the main carbon source for the plant, right? And so where does that carbon source, that building blocks of all of the parts of the plant, comes from that carbon source? And that carbon source is atmospheric carbon dioxide. That's the majority of this mass. And of course, water. And so these are the two parts that go into the photosynthetic process to build sugars from sunlight, and carbon dioxide and water. Those are the main ingredients here. And so really the majority of that mass of the plant is actually obtained from the atmosphere, carbon dioxide, and then the water coming in through the plant roots. This is sort of mind-blowing that all of that mass can come from things that are so diffuse in our environment. So the question then becomes, well, what about that difference of 0.066% in the soil? Was that just measurement error, or is this actual is this actually a difference that 60 grams that's lost? What is that actually a difference? Did that get taken into the plant? And the answer to that is actually no. This is not just measurement error. This 0.066% decrease in the weight of the soil is actually the essential nutrients that are in the soil taken up in the water, with the water in the soil. So these are the essential nutrients that are lost from the soil and added to the plant. So while the large majority of a large majority of the mass does not come from the plant, it comes from carbon dioxide and water. Some of the mass does actually come from the soil, and that is in the form of essential nutrients that are lost from the soil and added to the plant itself. And so what are essential nutrients? Well, essential nutrients are those that are absolutely required for normal growth. So essential nutrients are required by the plant for normal growth and reproduction. That says reproduction. So essential nutrients are required for normal growth and reproduction. On top of that, these cannot be replaced by any other element. So no other element can substitute. And then finally, these are nutrients that are essential for some specific structure or metabolic function. So these are necessary for some specific structure or metabolic function. Making these essential in the plant. So where do these essential nutrients come from? These are obtained from the soil and the air. And so parts of these are ones that we've talked about already. So carbon is an essential nutrient in a plant. Where does that come from? Well, that's available to the plants in the form of carbon dioxide, and that is taken up through the stomata when stomata are open during photosynthesis. So this is a major component of all the organic compounds and make up about 45% of the dry weight of a plant. The other essential nutrient that's here involved in photosynthesis is hydrogen. Hydrogen, of course, comes in the form of water. Also a major component of the organic compounds that are found in the plant. And when we look at the dry weight of a plant, average dry weight, this hydrogen from water takes up about 6% of that average percentage of that dry weight. And then, of course, oxygen is the other piece of this. Oxygen comes in both in the form of oxygen from being uptaken by the roots, as well as from water, from the splitting of water. So we've got it in both places. And oxygen makes up about 45% of the dry weight of plants. So the large majority, 96% of that weight of the dry weight of plants is coming from carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. These are three essential elements that are obtained from both the air and the soil. Along with these essential, and so before I move on to the next one, I'll just mention that when we talk about essential nutrients, these include both macronutrients and micronutrients. And so I want to differentiate these for you here because we'll talk about both macro and micronutrients. And so macronutrients, and this doesn't have to do with the size of them. Macronutrients are those that are required in large quantities. And necessary for the formation of macromolecules in the plant. Necessary for the formation of macromolecules. These macronutrients, so carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen all represent macronutrients in a plant. Micronutrients, on the other hand, are ones that are required in small quantities. And typically, these are nutrients that are typically used as enzyme cofactors and part of the metabolic process and different metabolic processes in the plant. So not the formation of these macromolecules like we see for macronutrients. So these are typically enzyme cofactors and things like that. But the key here is how much the plant needs them, how much of them are needed. So are they required in large quantities? And if so, they're macronutrients that are necessary for the formation of macromolecules, or they're required in small quantities, and those are micronutrients. And these are typically enzyme cofactors that help in different metabolic processes in the plant. And so so I've already mentioned macronutrients, hydrogen, carbon, and oxygen, mostly obtained from the air and also from the soil, from water in the soil. But we also have some elements that are macronutrients that are obtained from the soil. So here, let me clarify this up here. So I shouldn't say air and soil. Let's say these essential nutrients. These ones are obtained from the air and water, and these essential nutrients are ones that are obtained from the soil. And so these are essential macronutrients. So we need these in large quantities, and they're typically they're components of these macromolecules. And so in this column here, we see sort of what piece of the macromolecules these macronutrients are used for. And so these include things like nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, NPK. Those of you who have done any gardening before know that nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus are three of the main things that are found in fertilizers, but we also see other essential macronutrients like calcium, magnesium, and sulfur that are contained within those. And then here's just an amount that's needed. A continuation of that average dry weight that we see this is a continuation of the table from above. So this is the average percentage of dry weight, and then some of the deficiency symptoms, and we'll talk about those a little bit later. But the main point here is that macronutrients also include elements like nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus, calcium, magnesium, sulfur. These are ones that are needed in relatively large quantities and for the formation of macromolecules. Along with those other essential nutrients include these micronutrients. And so these are ones that are needed in much smaller quantity. So these are much smaller quantities. Remember, this is that average percent dry weight of these nutrients, and include include things like chlorine and iron, magnesium, zinc, boron, copper, nickel. So all of those are things we think of as heavy metals, and in large quantities are actually toxic to the plant, but they're essential nutrients. They're required for normal growth and development of the plant in low quantities. And so things like nickel or copper, these very toxic in high quantities. And then also including molybdenum in here, and this is in a very small quantity. But the point is that each of these is an essential nutrient required for normal growth and development. And without them, there are different types of symptoms that actually occur. And so these range from things like having chlorosis or yellowing between the veins to necrotic tissue, death of tissues, and each essential nutrient actually has its own symptoms associated with that. And I don't know about you, but myself, when I tell people that I'm a botanist, one of the things that almost always comes up is like, oh, I have this houseplant at home and the leaves are turning yellow. What's wrong with it? And that's this is that information that those people always want, so we can just pass this table off to them and tell them. But these have been carefully studied, each one, and we'll talk about actually how they determine what are the symptoms of a deficiency in any one of these essential micronutrients or macronutrients. And so if we take a look at what happens when these nutrients are in short supply, we see various different symptoms. And so here's just 3 leaves. These are barley leaves, so this is a grass. And we see a normal leaf growing here on the left. It's all green and healthy looking. If there's a nitrogen deficiency, one of the essential macronutrients, nitrogen, we see the yellowing of leaves. A really common symptom of nitrogen deficiency is seeing yellowing of leaves. A phosphorus deficiency, another essential macronutrient, we'll see stunted growth and dead spots, necrotic tissue. That's what these spots are on the plant. And so that's for phosphorus deficiency. You see that. And so how are they determining in these different with these different micro and macronutrients, how do you actually determine what the symptoms are for essential nutrients? And so one of the main way that this is done is to actually grow these in hydroponic solutions. The hydroponic, you can use a control solution where that control solution contains all of the minerals. And then because this is in hydroponic solution, we can actually really accurately and precisely control without soil the availability of particular macro and micronutrients to the plant, and then look at the symptoms from that. And so here's our experiment that has a hydroponic solution of everything except for potassium. And when we don't have potassium, we see this chlorotic tissue along the veins of the plant. And so that's a way to actually determine which nutrients are essential. And so here's just another example of that, showing you, well, what happens if we don't have copper, if there's a copper deficiency in plants. And I like this example because if you remember, copper is an essential micronutrient that's actually required in a very small quantity in the plant. But it's a really important cofactor of certain enzymes that are present, and it's found in lignin of xylem. And so in woody plants especially, copper is very important. Okay, so let's look at, well, what happens if there's a copper deficiency in the plant. And so we can set up this hydroponic experiment where we've got a nutrient solution containing copper, and we have a nutrient solution that's our control plants. In our experimental plants, we have a nutrient solution without copper, and we can ask the question, what happens with copper deficiency? How does that affect plants? So our hypothesis here is that plants denied copper are going to grow poorly, and and the null hypothesis is that plants denied copper are going to grow normally. So we know it's an essential nutrient, so we know that that's not going to happen, right? And so let's see what are the results when we have copper deficiency in plants. Even an essential micronutrient that's required in such small quantities actually has a really large effect. And so here's some photographs of actual plants. Here's a normal plant grown hydroponically. This is a tomato plant where it has all of the essential nutrients available in that hydroponic solution, and then a copper deficient solution. And we see that we get poor growth in all tissues associated with this. And so those copper deficient plants had stunted growth, curled leaves, no flowers, so didn't reproduce. And overall, darker foliage all around. And so we see sort of a series of different functions, mostly associated with those enzyme cofactors in this tomato plant, where copper deficiency is leading to this poor growth that's affecting pretty much all of the tissues in the plant. And so I'm just going to scroll back up to this table here and let you know that, for our both our macronutrients and our micronutrients, I'm not interested in you memorizing all of the functions of all of the functions of each of these macro and micronutrients, or the amounts that they're in, or the deficiencies. I would like you to know which are macronutrients and those that are required in large quantities, and recognize there's a difference between macronutrients and micronutrients, but I'm not, and the main functions, macronutrients being in macromolecules, and micronutrients mostly being involved in enzymatic reactions. But I don't need you to memorize all of these. You can go and look up this table when you're wondering what's going on with your houseplant. The veins are turning yellow, and potentially be able to diagnose it that way. But I'm not worried about you memorizing these. Just recognizing what they are, what are your main macronutrients and micronutrients, and then how you would actually be able to study the differences that you see, and determining what the effects are for particular micro and macronutrients. And all of the essential nutrients, these have been studied using these hydroponic solutions, like I've described here. Okay. What I want to spend the rest of the time talking about is actually how plants are obtaining these nutrients. And so they're obtaining the nutrients primarily from the soil, except for those coming from carbon dioxide and oxygen, right? Those are the two that are not necessarily, they're not getting these from the soil. And so soils have an incredible importance in the availability of nutrients. That importance ranges from things like water availability in the soil. Since most of these micro and macronutrients are actually dissolved ions, they exist as ions dissolved in the water in the soil, water availability is a huge part of nutrient availability. And soil texture actually has a large impact on the availability of water. And so if you can categorize soil texture by size, we can see that it ranges from things like gravel, greater than 2 millimeters in size, all the way down through sand, silt, clay, clay being the finest particles. And that particle size has a lot to do with water availability and specifically the ease of drainage, where water is going to be most available in gravel soils, but it drains through very quickly. And in clay soils, it doesn't drain very quickly, and water at clay soils holds more water. but there are different trade-offs along with that. And so as we go from from rock and freezing and thawing of rock and organisms penetrating the cracks and water breaking and other organisms breaking these down into finer and finer soils, we have this sort of range from water availability to oxygen availability and everything in between that affects how water and nutrients will be available for the plant. This also affects how roots will be able to penetrate. And then, of course, this also affects oxygen availability. And so if you remember back to our discussion about roots and why roots can't live underwater, it's because they actually don't get oxygen. The same thing will happen in a soil situation where clay particles are so small, there aren't a lot of air spaces in there. They hold water and a plant can end up drowning in a pure clay soil. Or those particles are so packed so close together that the roots can't penetrate the soils. And so the overall texture of the soil, which is this process that includes both abiotic and biotic interactions to break down rock to soil particles, is incredibly important. Of course, the other part of soils that are very important is the organisms that are in the soil and the organic material in the soil. And so soil is not only just different sizes of former rock, like I showed in the last slide, but soil also includes an incredible amount of organic material, especially in that upper surface or the humus part of the soil. Sorry about that. The humus part of the soil. And then, of course, there's a huge microbial diversity in the soil as well. And these include both fungi, bacteria, and archaea. Protists, or these unicellular eukaryotes, I put them in parentheses because that's paraphyletic lineage, and other animals like nematodes shown in the slide here. And so all of these are contributing to the soil structure and the amount of nutrients that are in the soil. And so mature soils are really a complex mixture of organic and inorganic components, and that soil composition really determines what species of plants are actually capable of growth in that particular environment. But as far as our discussion here goes, right now, the main thing that I want to talk about is how this actually affects nutrient availability and the importance of soils in terms of that nutrient availability. And so, as I mentioned, elements are found in the soils as ions. And specifically, these are known as cations and anions in the soil. And so all of these elements like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, etc., all the essential micro and macronutrients are in the soil dissolved in water as charged particles. And so cations, just as a reminder, are ions with a positive charge. And these would include things like potassium, sodium, iron. These are all just examples of positively charged cations that are going to be found in the soil. And then anions, in contrast, are ions with a negative charge. And that negative charge would include important ions like nitrogen, which is often found as nitrates, phosphorus, which is often found as phosphates, and chlorine as another example of an essential micronutrient that that's found in the soils. But these are all found as anions and cations, and so these are dissolved in the soil water. And as such, and so I've shown this on here, as such, they can interact with, those anions and cations can interact with charged particles throughout the matrix. And so they will interact with charged soil particles, and they are susceptible to processes like leaching. And so because they're dissolved in that soil water, these are susceptible to leaching. I'll tell you what that is. And this is especially true of anions, or negatively charged sorry, this is true of both cations and anions that are dissolved in that soil water. And so what happens here is if they're in the soil water and the water can drain right through, these essential nutrients can actually just be washed through. We call this leaching. So this is the loss of those nutrients by washing through that interface where the plant roots are interacting with the soil water. So if they go through too quickly, the root hairs won't be able to pick them up, and so those will be leaching. So leaching can actually happen. Leaching happens in places with really easy drainage. So in sandy soils or gravelly soils, leaching can be a real problem. And then the cations especially will interact with charged soil particles. Particles. And so here we can see that clay particles are positively charged, and we see all those positive charges on these clay particles. Clay particles. I'm screwing this up. Clay particles are negatively charged, and we see all of the negatively charged clay particles here. And those cations that are found in the soil are then oftentimes bound up and actually bound to those soil particles. So clay is negatively charged and will bind cations. And what this is if these are bound, these are then unavailable to the plants. If they're bound if they're bound up if those cations are bound to those negatively charged clay particles or negatively charged organic matter, then those positively charged cations, like that potassium ion, for example, is gonna be unavailable to the plant. And so because of that, because of the interaction of those soil particles, they resist leaching, but so they don't get leached through the water like our negative anions do, but they do get bound up and are made unavailable to the plants. And so so they resist leaching, but they're difficult for plants to absorb because they have this strong binding to clay particles and organic material. And so because of that, soil pH actually plays a really important role in nutrient availability in the plants. And so what's being shown on this, what's being shown in this figure here is we have some clay or organic matter that with their negative charges on the surface. And then we have some of these positively charged essential nutrients like calcium here or magnesium here. And both of those are bound to those clay particles. And so they're unavailable to the plant. But if there are protons in the water, so if the soil pH is such that there are free protons in the water, so that's associated with the pH, of course, then what can happen is we can have the protons actually replacing the cations on those clay particles, and this is something called cation exchange. And I'll come back to this in a little bit later. But cation exchange is one way that these soil particles can actually be made available, or these positively charged ions can be made available even in a clay soil. And so as the hydrogen then displaces those positively charged cations, then they're available to the plant to be taken up by the plant in the root hairs. The alternative here is leaching. Leaching of those cations. And so if very acidic soils then it can release all of those cations from a real acidic soil. All those cations will be released because the hydrogen ions will be bound to the clay particles. And then if water is draining through the soil, those calcium and magnesium ions, or whatever cations they are, will be leached out of the soil and then unavailable to the plant as well. And so it's really sort of a trade-off between having too acidic a soil in that where everything's leached out, or just enough to displace some of the cations to be able to be available to the plant. And so the best nutrient uptake is in more or less neutral soil, so pH 7. So those neutral soils are where we see the best nutrient uptake, and we balance. So you're balancing cation exchange with leaching of those nutrients in these more or less neutral soils. Okay, so I'll end here with just a short summary on soil properties and their effect on nutrient availability. So these are trade-offs between water availability, oxygen availability, cation exchange, and leaching. So all of these trade-offs, all of these are at play when we're talking about how nutrients are available in different types of soil. So in sand, we have low water availability. Water is going to drain right through, but you have a low capacity for cation exchange because those anions all leach, low for cation exchange because there are not very many charged particles in sand, and anions are going to leach out, but oxygen is very available. And root penetration, that's the one thing I didn't put on here. And root penetration is really easy because this doesn't pack very tight. If we contrast that with clay, clay has high water availability. They've got high possibility for nutrients. There's large capacity for cation exchange, and the anions will remain in solution. But the oxygen availability is very low because there's few air containing spaces and it packs tight, so it's hard for roots to penetrate. You add organic material into that, and we increase the availability of oxygen because we've got many air containing spaces. So obviously the best soils are going to be a mix of sands and clays and organic matters in these systems. Okay, I'm going to end that right here, and we'll pick this back up looking at nutrient uptake and how nutrients are actually taken up in plants through the root hairs. All right, we'll see you next time.